You feel like you're living on autopilot, where you're just like on a treadmill of life that just continues on and you just keep pushing forward, where days turn into weeks, turn into months, turn into years, and you wonder what happened with your life. Defining your priorities is essential to living the life you want. And setting priorities is so important. It helps dictate and help you discern how best to use your time, how best to use your energy so that you can live a joy-filled life that is meaningful to you. Perhaps you've heard of the jar analogy before, and I just so happen to live with two boys who actually keep jars of rocks in their rooms. But this jar analogy, where how you fill your jar with things that are important will impact what you have space left over for. So if you take the big things that are most important and put them in first as big rocks, you'll have room for smaller rocks and pebbles and sand and eventually water to fill up with other things. But if you start with things that aren't important, so like water or sand in the case of the jar analogy, then you don't have space for your big rocks. And I used to believe that big rocks needed to be things that took up a lot of time. So work was a big rock. And so that would fill up my jar. And I realized over time and over doing a lot of work with my priorities that I actually don't prioritize work. What I prioritize is accompanying and supporting and encouraging folks in daily life. And so that became my big rock. And I do that in my job, I do that in other ways as well. But that became my priority for how I engage that work. I used to also have a big rock that was called mom, right? Like this role that is super important to me. And it would fill my jar and be one of the first things in as I thought about my priorities. But really, it is not just the role of mom that is a priority for me. It is really how I live that out. And so it means being authentic and being open and creating space so that my kids can be authentic and open as well. So it's about connection. And so it became more about how I do that than versus this like ambiguous role and hat that I have. And so shifting those priorities and helping define how we live out those priorities, I know has been life changing for me. And when we're able to set those priorities in really meaningful ways, we can get out of the daily grind. We can get off the treadmill a bit and start living with intention so that we're able to live a life we want to live now while also preparing for the future. And so when we don't set those priorities, it gets real easy to get into that grind mentality where we're just doing for the sake of doing, or we have goals and we have tasks and we have things that we need to get done, but they're not encompassing what we really want to be doing. They're not really focused on our priorities. So we end up wasting time on tasks that aren't as important. And we can just feel overwhelmed by all that there is to do when we aren't grounded and rooted in our priorities. And so when I think about priorities, I do two different things, and I encourage you to do the same. I think from the 30,000-foot view, where do I want to be? What does my future self want 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What are my priorities then? And how am I incorporating those now so that I can be moving towards that future self? Also, from that 10-foot view, right? Like, what is important to me right now, today, this year, during the course of this season of my life, so that those things are prioritized as well. And so I make sure that kind of do an ecology check, make sure that both of those things are in congruence with each other so that I'm able to live into my priorities both now and also working towards those goals for the future. So I take those priorities and I make goals. I make goals and then I chunk down those goals. I think sometimes we have goals that are really big and then they become really overwhelming, so we don't move toward them. And we can chunk those down into really actionable steps so that our priorities are front and center. So it looks like doing specific things so that I'm able to connect with my kids. It looks like having specific tasks each week on my list for work so that I'm able to connect and support others really well. And then I check in, and I encourage you to check in with yourself as well. Our priorities change. And so for me, it looks like doing annual check ins that look at that future self and look at my current self and figure out what are my priorities right now. But it also means doing that on the monthly basis, on the weekly basis, and on the daily basis so that I'm continually keeping those front and center so that I am living an abundant life now. So I encourage you folks, if you don't know your priorities or haven't taken the time to sit down and really figure out like what are your big rocks that matter that aren't just like this ambiguous role or this ambiguous hat that you wear, but what is really essential to your well-being and living into your authentic self. Figure out how does that play out in daily life? What does that look like as far as creating goals? What does that look like as far as creating space and action steps to keep those priorities front and center? And if you are totally lost and don't even know your priorities or have really clear priorities but aren't sure how to create goals around that, feel free to reach out. You are not alone in this. As I mentioned, accompaniment is kind of my jam and would love to work with you and encourage you and support you on this journey.